In Virginia's plantation records, there is a pattern that should not exist. Names carefully written at birth, ages updated year by year, and then, suddenly, silence. At exactly 12 years old, children vanished from the ledgers. No bills of sale, no transfer records, no death notices. They were not sold, they were not buried, they were simply removed. Tonight, we uncover the hidden system behind those disappearances and why no one ever wrote down where the children went. Before we go any further into this story, take a moment to subscribe to the Black Timeline, hit the bell icon, and stay with us until the end, because what you are about to hear was never meant to be noticed, let alone remembered, and once you see the pattern, you will never look at historical records the same way again. In the early decades of the 19th century, Virginia's plantation system ran not just on labor, but on paperwork, an obsessive culture of documentation that reduced entire human lives to lines of ink, numbers, and margins, and at first glance, these records appear thorough to the point of cruelty, listing births, ages, physical descriptions, assigned tasks, punishments, illnesses, and valuations with chilling consistency, creating the illusion that nothing escaped the gaze of the system, that everything and everyone was accounted for. Children born into slavery were logged within days of birth, often listed beneath their mothers' names, sometimes with a single-word notation like infant or newborn, and as the years passed, those same names would reappear annually, their ages incremented, their bodies slowly transformed in ink from dependents to potential laborers, a quiet countdown written without ceremony. For the first years of life, the records are predictable, almost monotonous. The child exists, the child ages, the child remains attached to the mother's entry, treated as an extension of her labor and value. But then, somewhere between the ages of 11 and 12, something changes, not abruptly in language, not dramatically in tone, but decisively in consequence. The child's name appears one final time, often without comment, and then it never appears again. No explanation follows. No transaction is recorded. No death is noted. The space where the name should be becomes occupied by silence, a silence so clean and consistent that it escaped notice for generations because historians were trained to read what was written, not what was missing. Plantation owners continued to record everything else with unwavering diligence: crop yields, livestock births, equipment purchases, debts owed, debts forgiven. Even the deaths of animals were logged with more explanation than the disappearance of these children. And yet, year after year, ledger after ledger, county after county, the same absence appeared at the same age, forming a pattern that only becomes visible when records are placed side by side, when individual plantations are no longer viewed in isolation but as components of a broader system. What makes this pattern so disturbing is not just that children vanished, but that their disappearance violated the very logic of slavery's bureaucracy, because in a system where enslaved people were property, removal without documentation was irrational, unless documentation itself posed a risk. Sales were taxable, transfers were traceable, deaths reduced asset value and required explanation, but disappearance created no paper trail, no questions, no oversight. To vanish a child without record was to erase not only the person but the liability, and the repetition of this erasure at the exact same age suggests planning, not neglect. 12 years old was not an arbitrary number, it marked a threshold recognized across the plantation economy. The moment when a child's body was considered sufficiently formed to be reshaped into something else, something more profitable, something less visible. At this age, children were often removed from materna quarters under the justification of reassignment, though the term rarely appears explicitly, and the records simply move on as if the child never existed, continuing to log the mother, the fields, the tools, the harvests, maintaining the illusion of continuity. For the families who owned these plantations, there was nothing unusual about this process. It was normalized through repetition, accepted through tradition, and protected through silence. Overseers did not question it because they were trained not to ask questions that were not their concern, and county clerks did not record it because they were not instructed to. Even neighboring plantations, which often shared labor and resources, participated in this quiet understanding that certain movements were better left unspoken. The children were not lost, they were relocated, transformed, absorbed into another layer of the system that operated beneath the visible surface of plantation life. Yet for the mothers left behind, whose names continued to appear in the records long after their children vanished, the absence was anything but abstract. The ledgers do not record their grief, their confusion, or their fear, but the sudden isolation of their entries. Once paired with a child's name and now standing alone, tells its own story, a visual gap that speaks louder than any written explanation. These women were expected to continue working, to continue producing, to continue existing within the system as if nothing had happened, and the records reflect this expectation by refusing to acknowledge the rupture. Over time, this pattern became invisible precisely because it was so common, woven into the fabric of plantation management until it no longer registered as an event, only as procedure. Historians studying individual plantations often missed it because there was no single dramatic incident to analyze, no scandal, no legal dispute, only a quiet subtraction repeated hundreds of times. It was only when researchers began to cross-reference records across estates, comparing birth registries with later inventories, that the truth emerged. Children were disappearing at 12, not sporadically, not accidentally, but systematically. This realization forces us to reconsider what plantation records were designed to do, because while they present themselves as comprehensive accounts, they were never intended to tell the whole truth, only the truth that sustained the system. Anything that threatened that stability, anything that revealed the mechanisms of control operating behind the scenes, was excluded by default. The disappearance of these children was not a failure of record-keeping, it was a success of concealment. And as we move forward in this story, the question shifts from whether these children vanished to why the system worked so hard to ensure that their vanishing left no trace, because understanding that motive reveals a darker, more deliberate architecture beneath the surface of slavery, one that depended not just on force, but on erasure. Once the pattern of disappearance becomes visible, the age itself demands attention, because 12 was not simply a number on a page, but a boundary deeply embedded in the logic of slavery, a moment when the system's expectations of a child shifted decisively and permanently, transforming how that life would be used, controlled, and recorded. In Virginia's plantation culture, childhood was never defined by innocence or protection, but by usefulness, and usefulness was measured not by years lived, but by physical readiness and psychological malleability. Before the age of 12, enslaved children were often categorized as young, small, or attached, meaning they remained close to their mothers, performed light tasks, and were considered supplemental rather than essential labor. They were visible in the records because they represented future value, an investment still in development, and their presence alongside their mothers helped stabilize work routines and reduce resistance. But as a child approached 12, overseers and owners began to see them differently, not as dependents, but as raw material, bodies that could now be reshaped into specialized tools within the plantation economy. At this age, children were considered old enough to endure longer hours, harsher discipline, and more deliberate conditioning, yet young enough that their identities were not fully formed, making them easier to break, retrain, and detach from familial bonds that might interfere with obedience. This was the age when the system could still mold behavior without confronting the hardened resistance often found in adults. And plantation manuals and private letters from the period reveal a shared understanding that 12 marked the optimal moment for reassignment, though that term, when it appears at all, is cloaked in euphemism. Children at this threshold were no longer treated as extensions of their mothers, but as independent units of value. And independence, within slavery, meant vulnerability, because it stripped them of the limited protection that proximity to family sometimes afforded. This shift explains why their names disappear so cleanly from records. Once detached, they entered a different category of management, one that operated with far less transparency. Unlike adult transfers, which often required documentation due to their impact on property valuation and labor allocation, the movement of children could be obscured under internal reorganization, especially when plantations were owned by interconnected families who shared labor pools and trusted one another to maintain silence. 12-year-olds could be moved under the guise of training, apprenticeship, or domestic preparation, labels that sounded benign but masked a reality of intense conditioning designed to prepare them for roles that required complete submission. For boys, this often meant being sent to labor camps or skilled workshops where obedience was drilled alongside physical endurance, while for girls, the transition was even more perilous as they were evaluated not only for labor potential but for reproductive capacity, a consideration that rarely appeared explicitly in records but loomed over every decision. The system understood that controlling reproduction was as important as controlling labor, and 12 marked the beginning of that control, the point at which a girl's body became something to be monitored, managed, and eventually exploited. This is why the age appears so consistently across different plantations and regions. It was not coincidence, but policy, informal yet widely understood, passed down through practice rather than statute. The disappearance of children at 12 allowed plantation owners to avoid scrutiny at a critical moment, because documenting the next phase of these children's lives would have revealed practices that, while legal, were morally indefensible even by the standards of the time, particularly when it came to sexual exploitation and forced breeding. By removing children from visible records at the moment they became most vulnerable, the system created a buffer between what it did and what it admitted to doing, preserving the facade of order while hiding the violence necessary to sustain it. This strategy also served to fragment enslaved communities, because the sudden removal of children at a predictable age generated fear and uncertainty, undermining solidarity and discouraging resistance, as parents learned that attachment itself could invite loss. Mothers watched their children approach 12 with dread they could never articulate openly, knowing that the ledgers would soon stop acknowledging their existence and that whatever awaited them would be beyond the reach of any plea or protest. The records, in their silence, reflect this reality by continuing on as if nothing had changed, listing mothers without their children, labor assignments without explanati, on inventories without discrepancy, maintaining a smooth surface that concealed profound disruption beneath. Over time, this practice became normalized, so embedded in plantation management that it required no discussion, no justification, and no formal policy, only repetition. Clerks did not question the absence because absence was expected, and owners did not explain it because explanation created risk. The age of 12 thus functioned as a hinge between visibility and invisibility, between childhood acknowledged and exploitation concealed, marking the moment when a child's life entered a phase that the system preferred not to see itself enact. Understanding why 12 mattered is essential, because it reveals that the disappearances were not random gaps or clerical oversights, but deliberate transitions into a shadow economy of labor and control, one that relied on secrecy to function. And as we move deeper into this story, the question becomes not only what happened to these children after they vanished from the ledgers, but how an entire society collaborated, through silence, routine, and record-keeping, to ensure that their transformation remained hidden, unchallenged, and largely forgotten. Once we understand why age 12 mattered, the next question becomes unavoidable and far more unsettling, because in a slave economy obsessed with ownership, valuation, and transfer, disappearance without sale should have been impossible, and yet the records insist on it again and again. These children were not sold. In Virginia's plantation system, sales were among the most carefully documented events imaginable, involving bills of sale, witnesses, county filings, and tax assessments, because enslaved people were among the most valuable forms of property an owner possessed, and any transaction involving them had legal and financial consequences that could not simply be ignored. Even illegal, questionable sales often left traces, partial entries, crossed-out names, or marginal notes, because the movement of human property disrupted inventories and required adjustment elsewhere in the books. But when historians traced the names of children who vanished at 12, they found no such disruptions, no compensating entries, no sudden influx of cash, no debts settled, no purchases made with proceeds from a sale. The plantation's financial rhythm continued uninterrupted, as if nothing of value had left, which tells us something crucial. These children did not leave the system, they were absorbed into it in a way that did not register as loss. This realization shifts the interpretation of their disappearance from one of absence to one of concealment, because if they were not sold, then their removal was internal, orchestrated within networks of ownership that allowed people to be moved without triggering the mechanisms designed to track them. Virginia's plantation elite often operated through extended families, trusts, and informal partnerships, owning multiple properties across counties and even states, and within these networks, enslaved people could be transferred quietly, listed under collective tallies rather than individual names, especially if they were young and untrained. Children disappearing from one ledger often reappear elsewhere not as individuals, but as numbers, juveniles, youth, or new stock, stripped of identity and history, effectively laundered through anonymity. This practice allowed owners to avoid taxes, scrutiny, and moral inquiry, while still reallocating labor to where it was most needed or profitable. It also meant that the children's original identities were deliberately severed, because names carried memory, and memory carried risk. A child with no documented past could be shaped more completely, disciplined without witnesses who knew them as something else, and exploited without the complication of familial claims. The absence of sale records thus becomes evidence of a deeper system of control, one that treated children not as discrete assets, but as movable components within a larger machine, transferable without acknowledgement because their value was not yet fully realized. Plantation correspondence from the period hints at this practice obliquely, referring to placements, assignments, or training arrangements, phrases that sound administrative but conceal profound violence, because they describe the forced removal of children from everything familiar into environments designed to erase who they had been. For boys, this often meant being sent to distant properties where labor demands were high and oversight was strict, places where they would be broken into obedience before being integrated into adult work gangs, while for girls, the implications were more complex and more dangerous, as their movements were tied not only to labor needs, but to long-term reproductive strategies that owners rarely committed to paper. The system relied on the fact that children were legally property without agency, allowing them to be moved without consent or explanation, and because they were young, their removal attracted less attention than the transfer of adults, whose absence might disrupt work patterns or provoke resistance. This invisibility was strategic because it minimized the emotional and logistical impact of the transfer while maximizing the owner's control over the outcome. Mothers were left behind with no documentation to point to, no record to reference, no proof that their children had been taken rather than sold or killed, which kept them in a state of uncertainty that discouraged inquiry. The records reflect this by maintaining the mother's entry as if nothing had changed, her labor continuing uninterrupted, her productivity unaffected on paper, reinforcing the fiction that the system functioned smoothly. Over time, the normalization of this practice meant that no single disappearance seemed remarkable, but when viewed collectively, the pattern becomes unmistakable. A generation of children funneled out of visibility at the precise moment they became most useful, not through the market, but through internal channels designed to evade documentation. This challenges the traditional narrative that focuses on slave sales as the primary mechanism of family separation, revealing instead a quieter, more insidious process that operated alongside the market, one that left fewer traces and therefore fewer opportunities for later recognition. The fact that these children were never sold does not mean they were spared exploitation. It means their exploitation was considered too integral to the system to risk exposure. Their lives were redirected in ways that benefited owners without creating a paper trail that could be questioned or contested, a strategy that required coordination, trust, and shared understanding among the plantation elite. And as we follow this thread further, it becomes clear that the children's disappearance was not an endpoint, but a transition into spaces deliberately kept off the books, places where control could be exercised more completely because no one was supposed to be watching, and where the absence of records was not a gap in history, but a shield protecting practices that could not withstand the light. Following the trail beyond the moment of disappearance, the evidence points toward a layer of the plantation system that operated quietly, deliberately, and largely outside formal documentation, a network of domestic relocation sites and reproductive labor compounds that historians later struggled to name because the people who ran them never did so explicitly, preferring euphemism, omission, and administrative vagueness over clarity. By the second decade of the 19th century, Virginia's economy had begun to shift, with soil exhaustion reducing profits from traditional crops in some regions, while demand for enslaved labor surged in others, particularly in the expanding plantations of the Deep South, Anne. This imbalance created incentives not only to sell enslaved people, but to manage their reproduction strategically, especially children who could be shaped into compliant workers and future producers. The children who vanished from ledgers at 12 often entered this shadow system through domestic relocation, moved to properties owned by the same families or their associates, where they were absorbed into new labor structures under altered classifications that obscured their origins. These were not public markets or auction blocks, but private arrangements, often governed by trust agreements and family compacts that allowed human property to circulate without triggering the formalities of sale. Some children were placed into households as domestic servants, a role that offered proximity to white families and tighter control, while others were sent to inland farms where oversight was stricter and resistance could be crushed early, and in both cases the goal was the same: sever previous bonds and rebuild identity around obedience. For girls, the relocation carried additional implications because plantation correspondence and estate planning documents reveal a preoccupation with increase, a term that appears frequently in relation to livestock and occasionally, tellingly, in reference to enslaved populations, signaling an understanding that reproductive capacity was an economic asset to be managed. While no ledger bluntly states the purpose of these relocations, the clustering of adolescent girls at certain properties, the careful tracking of their health and physical development, and the subsequent appearance of infants attributed to unnamed mothers all point toward environments where reproduction was not incidental but anticipated. These sites were often described in neutral terms: outlying farms, secondary holdings, or training properties, labels that concealed their function while preserving plausible deniability, and because they operated within extended family networks, they rarely attracted outside scrutiny. The movement of children into these spaces was facilitated by the same invisibility that marked their disappearance from original records. Once removed from maternal listings, they became part of aggregated counts, indistinguishable from others and therefore easier to manage without accountability. Domestic relocation also served to discipline behavior because children placed in new environments learned quickly that survival depended on compliance, and without family nearby to advocate or remember them, they existed entirely at the mercy of those who controlled their labor and bodies. The system relied on this isolation because attachment was seen as a liability, something that could inspire resistance or escape, and by redistributing children at a young age, owners minimized those risks while maximizing control. Over time, these practices became standardized through custom rather than law, passed down as best practice among plantation managers who understood that certain operations were better conducted beyond the reach of official oversight. Clerks tasked with record-keeping were often instructed to maintain aggregate tallies rather than individual names, a practice justified as efficiency but functionally serving to erase identity. And when questioned, owners could point to internal reorganization as a benign explanation. The result was a system that produced labor and population growth while generating minimal documentation, effectively insulating itself from future inquiry. The children themselves became living evidence of this hidden infrastructure, their lives shaped by forces they could not see and never consented to, their pasts erased so thoroughly that even later, emancipation offered little clarity about where they had come from. This erasure extended beyond names to memory itself, because without records, communities struggled to reconnect after separation, and descendants were left without the eons to trace lineage or reclaim history. The normalization of these practices reveals a plantation society adept at compartmentalization, capable of maintaining a public face of order and legality while sustaining a private economy of exploitation that relied on silence. By relocating children into spaces where their development could be controlled and their exploitation intensified without documentation, the system ensured that the most vulnerable phase of their lives remained hidden, and this concealment was not accidental but foundational, allowing slavery to adapt to changing economic conditions while preserving its core logic. As we move forward, the focus shifts from the machinery of relocation to its human cost, to the mothers left behind, the bonds severed without explanation, and the psychological violence inflicted through absence. Because understanding what these hidden sites did requires confronting not only where the children went, but what their disappearance meant for those who were forced to live with the silence that followed. What the records never say outright but reveal through their cold consistency is how the system depended on the endurance of those who remained, particularly the mothers whose lives continued on paper after their children were erased, as if continuity of labor could substitute for continuity of family, and as if silence could stand in for consent. In the years following a child's disappearance, a woman's name often persists in the ledgers with a steadiness that feels almost cruel, her age advancing, her assigned tasks unchanged, her productivity measured and remarked upon as if the most significant event of her life had not just occurred. And this persistence is not evidence of indifference, but of coercion, because survival under slavery required an outward compliance that the records mistake for stability. The separation was engineered to leave no trace, and that engineering extended to the management of grief itself, because plantation discipline did not merely regulate bodies, it regulated speech, inquiry, and memory, teaching women quickly that asking where a child had gone could invite punishment, sale, or worse. The absence of recorded protest does not indicate acceptance. It indicates a system in which protest could not be documented because it could not be safely expressed. Mothers learned to read the cues that preceded disappearance, the sudden attentiveness of overseers, the quiet reassignment of sleeping quarters, the whispered instructions delivered at night, and by the time a child reached 12, dread became an unspoken companion, something carried privately because speaking it aloud risked accelerating the very loss they feared. Afterward, the routine of work resumed with a brutality that the records smooth over, because the plantation depended on continuity, on the ability of women to keep producing labor even as their families were dismantled piece by piece. Some entries mark these women as steady, sound, or reliable, terms that appear to praise but in fact signify something more chilling: the successful suppression of visible distress, the conversion of suffering into efficiency. This transformation was not accidental. It was cultivated through punishment and surveillance, reinforced by examples made of those who refused to comply, whose resistance resulted in sale or isolation that severed remaining ties. In this way, the system weaponized maternal attachment, using the threat of further loss to ensure obedience, a strategy that required women to internalize restraint, to grieve silently, to remember privately. The records offer occasional glimpses of this pressure in indirect ways, such as sudden notations of illness following a child's disappearance, brief declines in output that are quickly corrected, or transfers of women to different work assignments that may have served as reminders of their precarity. But these glimpses are fleeting, quickly subsumed back. into the rhythm of accounting because the ledger's purpose was not to tell a story but to maintain order. The emotional toll of separation was therefore rendered invisible, absorbed into the daily grind, leaving future readers with the false impression that life continued uninterrupted. Yet the pattern of repeated disappearances within the same families suggests a cumulative trauma that cannot be ignored, because some women lost multiple children in this way, each vanishing at the same age, each absence reinforcing the lesson that attachment was dangerous. Over time, this produced a form of enforced emotional discipline, a survival strategy that allowed women to function within the system by limiting visible investment in bonds that could be so easily broken. This discipline, however, should not be mistaken for numbness. It was a calculated adaptation, a way of preserving inner life by shielding it from a world that sought to exploit it. Oral histories collected long after emancipation hint at this interiority, describing mothers who carried the memory of lost children quietly, passing down names and stories in whispers, preserving what the records erased through private remembrance. These memories, fragile and fragmented, stand in contrast to the official silence, revealing a parallel archive of grief that existed alongside the written one, sustained through storytelling rather than ink. The system could remove children from ledgers, but it could not fully erase them from the minds of those who loved them, and this tension between documented absence and remembered presence underscores the violence of erasure itself. For plantation owners, the removal of children was framed as management, a necessary adjustment in the distribution of labor and value, and the continued productivity of mothers served as proof that the system worked. For the women, it was a rupture that reshaped their understanding of safety, trust, and time, because the approach of each child's 12th year marked a countdown not to maturity, but to loss. The ledger's refusal to acknowledge this reality reflects a broader strategy of normalization, one that treated the breaking of families as routine, unworthy of remark, and by doing so, rendered it easier to repeat. This normalization extended beyond individual plantations, creating a shared culture of silence in which mother's suffering was both ubiquitous and unseen, a background condition of the system rather than a problem to be addressed. When later historians encountered these records, the absence of explicit commentary on separation allowed them to underestimate its prevalence and impact, reinforcing narratives that focused on economic mechanisms while sidelining emotional realities. But when the records are read with attention to what disappears as much as to what remains, a different picture emerges, one in which the endurance of mothers becomes central to the system's functioning, not because it was freely given, but because it was relentlessly demanded. Their continued presence in the ledgers is therefore not evidence of resilience alone, but of a coercive environment that forced women to carry unbearable losses without acknowledgement, converting grief into an unrecorded cost absorbed by those least able to refuse. As we move forward, this understanding reframes the disappearances not just as logistical maneuvers, but as acts that relied on the suppression of maternal bonds to succeed, and it prepares us to examine how the system ensured that these bonds, once broken, would not reassert themselves through inquiry or resistance, by designing a structure in which silence was safer than speech and forgetting was rewarded with survival. What becomes increasingly clear, once the mother's silence and endurance are understood as coerced rather than voluntary, is that the disappearance of these children depended not on secrecy in the dramatic sense, but on a far more effective mechanism, normalization through omission, a system in which certain actions were so routine, so embedded in daily management, that they no longer required explanation, justification, or even acknowledgement on paper. Plantation record-keeping was never a neutral act. It was a technology of control, designed to track value, minimize risk, and protect ownership, and anything that threatened those goals was systematically excluded, not because it was unknown, but because it was too well known to be dangerous if documented. Writing something down created permanence, and permanence created vulnerability, because documents could be inspected, inherited, disputed, or reinterpreted by future authorities, and plantation owners understood that the most effective way to protect certain practices was not to falsify records, but to leave them blank. The disappearance of children at 12 fell squarely into this category because documenting where they went, why they were moved, or how they were used would have exposed the inner workings of a system that relied on plausible deniability to function. Officially, plantations presented themselves as orderly, lawful enterprises, operating within the boundaries of property law and social custom, and while the exploitation of enslaved labor was openly acknowledged, the mechanisms of psychological conditioning, forced separation, and reproductive control were far more vulnerable to scrutiny, even in a society that accepted slavery as normal. By leaving these mechanisms undocumented, owners insulated themselves from moral inquiry and legal risk, preserving a surface narrative of benign management while conducting more brutal operations beneath it. This omission was facilitated by the structure of record-keeping itself, which prioritized outcomes over processes, counting bodies rather than tracing lives, and allowing owners to report totals and productivity without accounting for how those numbers were achieved. Clerks, often young men trained to record what they were told and not to ask why, became instruments of this selective memory, reproducing a system in which silence was professional competence. They were not instructed to track internal relocations of children, nor to note changes that did not affect immediate valuation, and over time this absence of instruction hardened into convention, a shared understanding that certain movements were administrative details rather than historical events. The fragmentation of ownership further reinforced this invisibility, because many plantations were linked through family networks, trusts, and informal agreements that allowed enslaved people to circulate without triggering formal transfers, and within these networks, accountability dissolved, as responsibility was distributed across multiple actors who each controlled only part of the process. A child moved from one property to another within the same extended family did not require a sale, a receipt, or a public filing, and once relocated, their identity could be subsumed into aggregate counts, effectively laundering the transfer through bureaucracy. This structure ensured that no single document ever told the whole story, and that uncovering the truth would require a level of cross-referencing that no contemporary authority was likely to attempt. The decision not to write things down was therefore not negligence, but strategy, a way of managing risk in a system that depended on exploitation yet feared exposure. Even within private correspondence, language was carefully chosen, relying on euphemism and implication rather than explicit description, because letters could be intercepted, inherited, or cited, and vague phrasing offered protection. Terms like placement, preparation, or usefulness carried shared meanings among plantation elites, allowing them to coordinate without incriminating themselves, and this coded language functioned as a parallel archive, intelligible to insiders but opaque to outsiders. The result was a historical record that appears calm, orderly, and incomplete, not because chaos was absent, but because chaos was managed through silence. This silence extended beyond documentation into culture, shaping how people thought about what was worth recording in the first place, because in a society built on hierarchy, the lives of enslaved children were not considered events, but conditions, part of the background rather than the story. Their removal at 12 was treated as an expected transition, like a seasonal change or a shift in crop rotation, something that did not require comment because it was assumed. This assumption was reinforced by law, which granted owners near total authority over enslaved people and did not require them to justify internal management decisions, creating a legal environment in which omission was both safe and sanctioned. Over time, this produced a record that appears deceptively sparse, leading later generations to underestimate the scale and coordination of what occurred, mistaking silence for absence rather than evidence of deliberate concealment. The system's success lay in its ability to distribute responsibility so widely that no individual felt compelled to document the whole truth, and to normalize practices so thoroughly that they ceased to be perceived as exceptional. The children's disappearances were thus protected not by secrecy in the traditional sense, but by routine, by the quiet confidence that no one would ask because no one ever had. When questions did arise, they could be deflected with administrative explanations that sounded reasonable within the logic of slavery, such as internal reassignment or training, terms that implied care and preparation rather than coercion and loss. This logic was persuasive because it aligned with broader narratives about order, discipline, and improvement that plantation society used to justify itself, allowing even those who sensed the cruelty of the system to rationalize it as necessary or inevitable. The absence of documentation therefore becomes a record in itself, a negative space that reveals the boundaries of what the system could afford to acknowledge. And by examining that space closely, we begin to see how power operates not only through what is written, but through what is intentionally left unsaid. As we move forward, this understanding forces us to confront the consequences of such silence, not only for the children who vanished and the mothers who endured, but for the generations that followed, who inherited a history shaped by omission and who must now grapple with the task of reconstructing lives that were designed to disappear without a trace. When the silence of the records finally loosens its grip, what emerges is not a single destination for the children who vanished, but a scattering of afterlives shaped by anonymity, fragmentation, and forced adaptation, lives that continued not because the system cared to preserve them, but because it needed them to function while denying them continuity or recognition. Census returns from the mid-19th century offer fleeting glimpses of these individuals as adults, appearing suddenly in tallies as mulatto or black, with ages estimated rather than recorded, origins listed as unknown or left blank, as if their childhoods had never existed, and these entries are striking precisely because they float free of lineage, unattached to parents, places, or prior owners. The absence of origin is itself a marker, suggesting lives that entered adulthood without a documented past, people who had been moved, renamed, or absorbed into new environments so thoroughly that even bureaucratic systems designed to categorize could not trace them backward. Some appear as skilled laborers, carpenters, coopers, seamstresses, roles that required years of training, indicating that their disappearance at 12 marked the beginning of an intensive preparation process whose results were valued even as its methods were concealed. Others appear as field hands on large plantations far from their birthplaces, their presence explained only by internal redistribution networks that bypassed formal markets, and still others vanish entirely from the written record after childhood, suggesting lives cut short by disease, punishment, or overwork in spaces where documentation was minimal and deaths unremarked. For girls, the afterlives often include motherhood under coercive conditions, their children listed without paternal acknowledgement, folded into the same system that erased their own beginnings, creating generational loops of anonymity that compounded the original loss. Oral histories collected decades later hint at these trajectories through fragments. Stories of women who did not know where they were born, men who remembered being taken away at a young age, children raised without knowledge of siblings or parents beyond fleeting memories. And while these accounts lack the precision of written records, they offer emotional truth that fills some of the gaps left by paper. The afterlives of the disappeared were thus characterized by a profound dislocation, a sense of being unmoored from history, because identity under slavery was mediated by documentation, and to be undocumented was to exist without anchor, vulnerable to further manipulation. Even emancipation, when it came, did not fully resolve this dislocation, because freedom arrived without restitution of memory, leaving many formerly enslaved people struggling to reconstruct their pasts in a world that demanded proof they could not provide. Freedmen's Bureau records are filled with attempts to locate family members, inquiries that trace the paths of separation backward through time, and while some succeed, many end in frustration, their subjects listed as not found, a bureaucratic echo of the original erasure. These searches reveal how deeply the disappearance at 12 reverberated, shaping not only individual lives but collective memory, because each missing link represented a story that could not be fully told, a lineage that could not be fully traced. The system's reliance on disappearance thus extended its effects far beyond the moment of removal, creating a population of adults whose histories were truncated, whose sense of self was shaped by gaps they could feel but not name. Yet within these afterlives there are also traces of resilience, subtle and often unrecorded, expressed through community formation, storytelling, and the preservation of names and relationships through oral tradition rather than paper. People forged new bonds, constructed chosen families, and passed down fragments of memory that resisted total erasure, ensuring that while the system succeeded in obscuring origins, it did not entirely extinguish connection. These acts of remembrance were quiet, often invisible to outsiders, but they constituted a parallel archive that challenged the official one, preserving truths that could not be written down safely at the time. The tension between these two archives, the written and the remembered, underscores the limitations of relying solely on documents to understand the past, because documents reflect the priorities of those in power, while memory preserves the experiences of those subjected to it. The afterlives of the disappeared therefore compel us to rethink what counts as evidence, urging us to read between lines, to treat absence as a clue rather than a void, and to recognize that the continuation of life under conditions of erasure is itself a form of testimony. These individuals lived, labored, loved, and resisted in ways that rarely appear in the records, and yet their presence shaped the world around them, contributing to economies, cultures, and communities that history often credits to others. By tracing their afterlives, however imperfectly, we begin to see the long shadow cast by the moment of disappearance, how a decision made in childhood reverberated across decades, influencing not only where people ended up, but how they understood themselves and their place in the world. This understanding brings us closer to the final reckoning, because it reveals that the system's greatest violence was not only in what it did, but in what it denied: continuity, acknowledgement, and the right to be remembered, and it sets the stage for confronting how, despite all efforts to suppress it, the truth persists in patterns, in memories, and in the stubborn survival of lives that were never meant to be seen again. By the time we arrive at the end of this story, it becomes clear that the system which worked so carefully to erase these children ultimately failed in the one way it could not prevent, because while it controlled ink, it could not fully control pattern, and it is through pattern that the truth finally surfaces, quietly but unmistakably, across decades of fragmented documentation. The same ledgers that removed children at 12, the same censuses that listed adults without origins, the same inventories that counted bodies without names, all converge to reveal a structure that depended on disappearance as a method, not an accident. And it is this convergence that betrays the truth. The system tried so hard to bury. Plantation records were never meant to be read together across time and geography. They were designed to function in isolation, each one a self-contained account that discouraged comparison, and yet when modern researchers placed them side by side, aligning dates, ages, and absences, the illusion collapsed. Children did not vanish randomly. They vanished predictably. They vanished at the same age. They vanished without sale, and they vanished into spaces that left just enough trace to prove intention without ever naming it. This is how systems of power protect themselves, not by destroying evidence, but by fragmenting it, scattering pieces so widely that no single observer can see the whole. Yet fragmentation has a weakness. It assumes no one will ever gather the fragments, no one will ever ask why the same silence repeats itself, no one will ever treat absence as data. The truth that emerges from these records is not one of isolated cruelty, but of industrialized management of human lives. A system refined to maximize control while minimizing accountability. And that truth forces us to reconsider what historical documentation really represents. These ledgers were not mirrors of reality, they were tools that shaped reality, deciding whose lives were legible and whose were expendable, whose continuity mattered and whose could be erased without consequence. The disappearance of children at 12 was therefore not just a logistical maneuver, but a philosophical one, rooted in the belief that certain lives did not require narrative, that their transformation from child to exploited laborer did not deserve acknowledgement, and that their suffering could be absorbed into routine without moral cost. Yet despite this belief, the records could not fully suppress the consequences, because the adults who later appeared without origins, the families who could not be traced, the communities built around shared absence, all carried forward the imprint of what had been done. Freedom, when it arrived, exposed these gaps even more sharply, because it demanded histories that could not be produced. identities that could not be verified, and claims that could not be substantiated, leaving formerly enslaved people to navigate a world that required documentation they had been systematically denied. In this way, the disappearance at 12 continued to shape lives long after slavery itself had ended, extending its violence into the future through the denial of memory. The truth betrayed by the records is therefore not confined to the past. It lives in the enduring difficulty of reconstructing family, lineage, and self in the aftermath of erasure. And confronting that truth requires us to move beyond ready. NG history is a series of events, and toward understanding it as a series of choices. Choices about what to record, what to omit, and what to normalize. The people who designed and maintained this system chose silence because silence was safer than explanation, and they trusted that time would protect them, that future generations would accept the gaps as natural rather than intentional. But time did not protect them, it exposed them, because patterns endure longer than excuses, and when those patterns are finally seen, they demand reckoning. Remembering these children now is not about assigning names we may never recover or reconstructing lives in full detail. It is about refusing the logic that made their erasure acceptable, about recognizing that disappearance itself was a form of violence, and about honoring lives that were denied the dignity of being fully recorded. If this story has stayed with you, if it has changed how you think about history, about records, about silence, then subscribe to the Black Timeline, hit the bell icon, and stay with us. Because there are countless other truths still hidden in plain sight, waiting to be uncovered, and now leave a comment telling us how powerful and unsettling this story felt, because every act of attention, every refusal to look away, pushes back against the silence that once allowed children to vanish without a trace, and ensures that the truth those records betrayed will never disappear again.